Turn to the front of your Bible, and you'll find Judges followed by Ruth, and then 1 Samuel, and then 2 Samuel. In the New Testament, we have a 1 Corinthians and a 2 Corinthians. These are two distinct separate works. They are two completely different letters written by the same author to the same church in the same place, but at different times. This is not the case with 1 and 2 Samuel, or with 1 and 2 Kings, or with 1 and 2 Chronicles. These 6 books in our current Bible were originally just 3 books: the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, and the book of Chronicles. Hebrew is a pretty compact language, remember? No vowels. And so even with pretty lengthy works like Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, the whole books could fit on a single scroll, no problem. However, when these books were translated into the Greek Septuagint, the Greek language almost doubled their lengths. The origins of the Septuagint are interesting. Hebrew wasn't always spoken by ancient Jewish people, especially by Jews who lived in the Greek diaspora in Turkey, Greece, or Egypt. These Jews wanted and needed a version of the scriptures that they could read and understand. But how do you do that properly? I mean, God had inspired the writers of the Bible to write in Hebrew. How do you just change the language without totally misrepresenting what God intended in the original language? Well, the legend of the Septuagint says that they chose 70 translators, experts in both Hebrew and Greek languages. And then they took those 70 translators and placed each one on their own little island so that they were completely isolated from each other. And when they returned with their 70 translations under their arms, much to everyone's surprise, they all had the exact same translation. Not one word was different from the other. Therefore, says the legend, it must have been an act of God, and therefore this new Greek translation must be just as inspired as the original Hebrew. You can see the legend in the very name that is chosen for this Bible, Septuagint. You can see the little sept, 7 there. And to this day, scholars abbreviate the name in scholarly books as the LXX, the Roman numeral for 70. Obviously, there is nothing historic about this legend, but the Septuagint was widely used in the ancient Near East. In fact, when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it almost always quotes the LXX word for word. Thus, the Septuagint would have been intimately known by the gospel authors, St. Paul, and Jesus himself. There are some rather notable differences between the LXX and the Hebrew version of the Bible. In the Septuagint, there's an extra 151st Psalm. There's a couple of extra books, too, like the Wisdom of Solomon. The end of the book of Daniel is totally different. And Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles are split into 2 books each because in Greek they are so long that they will no longer each fit on a standard scroll. And in the Septuagint, the book of Ruth is moved from its later position in the Hebrew Bible to immediately between Judges and Samuel. Our modern Christian Bibles took many of their cues, not from the original Hebrew versions, but from the Septuagint. And so in our modern Bibles, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles are split into 2 books, and the book of Ruth is squeezed in before Samuel. But when the Bible was first being put together into what would become its mature Hebrew form, and as Baruch would have been editing the early books of the Bible, Ruth was not the 8th book of the Bible, and there was no 2 Samuel. The changes that the Septuagint make on our Bibles helped obscure the pattern of commandment violations that would have been far more evident had we kept the structure of the original Hebrew version that Jeremiah and Baruch would have known almost by heart. Okay. In Jeremiah's ordering of the commandments, the injunction against adultery is the 8th commandment. So in the Bible, adultery is consistently presented as sexual relations between a married woman and any man who isn't married to her. Of course, we have a far more egalitarian view of adultery these days, but for our purposes here, the differences between the ancient and modern sexual ethics doesn't really matter. In Leviticus, the punishment for adultery is death. Both participants are to be put to death. In a study on the commandment violations in the early books of the Bible, can you think of any prominent cases of adultery that figure into the story of early Israel? Of course, right? Only the most infamous case of adultery in human history, David and Bathsheba. And where does this story take place? Where is the eighth commandment violated? In the eighth book of the Hebrew Bible, of course, the book of Samuel. The book of Samuel details the transition of Israel from a loose confederation of 12 tribes to a real nation with a royal house of kings. Samuel and Saul were true transitional figures, kind of kings, but not quite full kings. And then the first real king of the nation of Israel was David. The move from Israel with no king to Israel with a king is interesting because God's plan was for there not to be a king. But Israel looked at all of their neighbors, and they saw royal households and palaces and kingly lineages. Kind of like when there's a British royal wedding and people in America wake up at 4 a.m. to watch it. That's the level of fascination that Israel had with royalty when they looked at all the other nations. In 1 Samuel, the elders of Israel approached Samuel to tell him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Did you see that? Like all the nations. God reluctantly tells Samuel to listen to the people and give them a king. "For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." You can hear God's heartbroken disappointment. It's an auspicious beginning to royalty in Israel, and it probably doesn't bode well for how the royal line will go. In fact, how does it go? How is it with the first real king, David? Was there any drama? Any scandal? Of course. In the 11th chapter of 2 Samuel, King David walks out on his balcony and surveys his kingdom. While surveying, he looks down and sees Bathsheba lying, bathing on her roof. This is a ritual bath. It's the normal ritual bath that a woman would take after her period of menstruation. Remember, in Old Testament law, this made a woman ritually unclean. And so when it was over, she had to wait several days and then take a bath to return her to a purified state. The function of this little detail does two things. First, it lets us know that when David looks down upon her, she's naked because she's bathing. Second, if she's bathing after her period, it lets us know that she's not pregnant yet. David sees her and wants her. He inquires about her to his advisors. They look into it and tell him that she's married to a man named Uriah, who is off fighting a war for David. Instead of seeing this as a disappointment and moving on, David sees this as an opportunity. He calls for Bathsheba and he commits adultery with her. And she gets pregnant, which couldn't be explained away because her husband isn't there. So then David calls for her husband to come off the battlefield and rejoin his wife. David wants to give them an opportunity for Uriah to think that he got her pregnant. Fighting battles in those days was considered holy work, though, and it was a battle for God, and sexual relations made you ritually unclean for a battle. So Uriah wouldn't go near his wife. And because David couldn't get away with his transgression in that way, he ordered his military commanders to put Uriah back on the battlefield, to put him in a dangerous situation, and then draw back from protecting him. Thus, in order to protect himself from scandal, David orchestrated Uriah's killing. This whole affair has devastating consequences for David and for the whole kingdom. It's basically his undoing. The child conceived in adultery dies. It's the moment where David's reign goes from pretty good to not so great. And it wouldn't be too many years after this that the nation splits into two nations, a northern kingdom with a king and a southern kingdom with a king. God didn't want them to have a king, and as it turns out, God was kind of right. It didn't go well. And the eighth commandment is broken in the eighth book of the Hebrew version of the Bible. Here's some questions to think about. What do you make of the creation of the Septuagint? And how does the story of David relate to today?